evening and welcome. Tonight on the show, we're catching up with the Accident Compensation Commission of Fiji, a relatively recent statutory body in Fiji. And we have with us Mr. Parvez Akbar. So, good evening and thank you very much for joining us.
Good evening.
Let's talk about some compensation payouts and the work of the ACCF since you were last here, I believe, in 2019, yes. Or was it 2020? Since then, let's start off from 2018. Could you share with us a summary of the compensation payouts from 2018 till date?
Yes, so thank you, Ziad. Look, we've paid a total of about 17 million approximately in compensation. And that's actually quite significant, especially when you consider the historical lack of payment of compensation under the old scheme. So 17 million is what we've paid out in total so far in the short time that we've been running since 2018. And the bulk of that, about 14 million, is from motor vehicle accidents. And the reason for that is that we started off with motor vehicle accidents in 2018. And then in 2019 we started doing employment and school accidents. And so 14 million for motor vehicle accidents, about a couple of million for employment accidents, and the rest are for school accidents. So 17 million altogether.
So the nature of accidents that have been compensated, just limited to motor vehicle accidents, employment and school accidents so far?
Yes. So at the moment we are compensating for serious injuries and deaths in those three areas.
A lot of people are still not aware on what the process is for claiming compensation. There's still a confusion as to what the stance of insurance is when put up against this compensation. So for someone who isn't aware, this is a no-fault compensation scheme.
Yes.
And it complements your existing insurance payouts? Okay.
So I'm glad you asked that question. So if we go back in time slightly, prior to the introduction of this scheme, you might recall people would have to, motor vehicle owners would buy third-party, compulsory third-party insurance. And so if there were injuries or deaths from a motor vehicle accident, you would liaise with your insurance company or the insurer of that vehicle. And lawyers would get involved, there'd be costs there. Many of the cases would end up in court and so on. So with the introduction of the scheme, that purchasing of compulsory third-party policies has been abolished. And so you can no longer buy compulsory third-party policies. For your vehicle, you now pay a motor vehicle accident levy to LTA, and that forms the basis of the funding which comes to us. So coming back to your question, the old policy, the old compulsory third-party policy, no longer exists, and the area of compensating for injuries and deaths now rests with ACCF. And this is for motor vehicle accidents, but we have now, of course, taken up employment and school accidents as well.
Mr. Akbar, if I may, with those that had existing policies prior to the ACCF coming into existence, for those that had done, say, for example, payouts, they had paid their dividends, they had done arrangements for certain payment, or say, for example, there were those that were trying to manipulate the system as well. However, they had invested some of their own money. For those that haven't claimed that, who haven't liaised with their agents, because there may be either agents or those that have existing policies that haven't done a follow-up to that, what's their recourse?
So what actually took place is the insurance companies were given an opportunity to what you could call as a transfer of their liability to ACCF. And so motor vehicles, so compulsory third-party policies remain valid up to, say, 31st of December 2017, at which point it stopped. And then so insurance companies had the option of transferring their liability by transferring premium to ACCF, and we took over the responsibility there. So most insurance companies have taken up that opportunity. There are a couple of insurance companies that didn't, and so they continue to be liable for accident during the period.
And from then until now, have you seen a more positive response to those that are liaising with the ACCF in terms of seeking compensation?
Look, absolutely. And you know, there's so many benefits, but I mean, for starters, there's no cost from our perspective. There's no filing fee, application fee, none of that. You don't need to visit a lawyer, so there's no legal costs. You don't have to go to court, and so people, it's far more easily accessible, and you'll find that the feedback we're getting is just fantastic because of that easy access to applying for compensation.
So what we'll do now is we'll go to a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about more details as to how someone who may have missed out can gain access to compensation under the ACCF scheme. So
Sure.
stay with us for that. We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back. We're with the Accident Compensation Commission of Fiji, and if you've recently had a school or workplace or a motor vehicle accident, you may be entitled to compensation as well. Mr. Akbar, you recently released in a press release that close to 80% of families who lost loved ones from motor vehicle accidents would have missed out from receiving compensation under the old law, whereas they've now been able to access this compensation. Could you expand on that a little?
Sure. So what we did, Ziad, is we analyzed the applications that we have received in the last 3 years, and then we basically looked at that alongside the old criteria that existed, and just purely on the fault requirement. So if I can just qualify that, before, under the old law, you would have to prove fault. So if you're a pedestrian, I ran you over, you'd actually have to prove that it was my fault as a driver, which is a huge challenge. And so under the ACCF scheme, it's a no-fault scheme. So irrespective of whose fault it is, you're entitled to compensation, except for a few exclusions. So what we did is we applied just the no-fault aspect of it, and we looked at the applications that we received, and then on that set of facts, we applied the old criteria and said, okay, if these were looked at under the old law, and if these people would have to prove fault, what would be the outcome? And we found that 80% of the compensation payments we've made for death under motor vehicle accidents actually would have missed out under the old scheme. So it's just I suppose statistical evidence basically of the success of the scheme, because that just goes to show how few people actually got compensation compared to ACCF. And so, I mean, 80%, and this is just applying fault. There were other exclusions. So I think from our perspective, the number is even better. I mean, more people actually would have missed out previously. So the success of ACCF is just quite evident from that itself, that so many people would have missed out. So what would have happened if they would have had an accident? The law would have required them to prove fault, and because it was their fault, or it wasn't the fault of the driver, they would not have received compensation, whereas now they are. And so those who've had accidents prior to 2018, they can't get compensation from us. They still can try under the old scheme. I suppose the point that we were making there is that the success of the scheme now is such that just the no-fault element itself ensures more people are now entitled to compensation.
While that may be a good thing for most, especially those who have suffered as a result of this, are there any caveats to the no-fault scheme?
There are no caveats to the no-fault aspect per se, but we do have some exclusions. Now, under the old law, the exclusions set in insurance policies, and so you are at the mercy of insurance companies and their little exclusions. With us, it's in the legislation that we have exclusions. There's a handful of exclusions, and if I can give you an example of how different they are. So if the driver is driving drunk, for example, or is under the influence of drugs, then he or she will not be entitled to compensation under our scheme. However, everybody else will be. So all the passengers, any passengers in the other vehicle or pedestrians, everybody gets compensation except for the driver. Under the old law, nobody got compensation because the driver had breached the terms and conditions of the policy. So that's just an example. We have other ones like, if you don't have the requisite license to drive that particular vehicle. So for example, if you're driving a minivan, you don't have a license to drive your minivan, a minivan, that's another exclusion. But again, it's just the driver that's penalized, not anybody else. And so those are the exclusions that we have. But as you can see, they're very targeted to the offender, if you like, as opposed to the old law where everybody just missed out, which was terrible.
So just to spin off from what you said in one of our earlier segments, you mentioned that there's no compulsory third-party, scheme purchasing. one of the questions we had was, what about all of the insurance companies and all the other companies that relied on, income from schemes like the third-party insurance?
Yes, so those insurance companies have other products which they sell, and so whether it's so for example, in terms of motor vehicle, they'll still insure your motor vehicle for damage, but they just can't for injuries and death. So I mean, a good way to look at ACCF and versus the insurance company in the motor vehicle space is they will now cover damage to the vehicle, and we will cover damage to the person. So I mean, that's probably an easy way to look at it. So, but and they also have other policies, burglary and medical insurance and other things that they still do. So, but that's where they're at. No.
So, I mean, it shouldn't be seen as the ACCF sort of coming in and taking up sort of a certain amount of market share for these insurance companies.
No, because we are just focused on personal injuries and death, and the challenges that existed, unfortunately, under the old law, made it untenable to continue that way, where when it came to personal injuries and death, people were at the mercy of the legal system and the insurance companies and so on. So that just was not sustainable going forward.
So in the past few years, since 2018, it seems very clear from the amount paid out that we seem to be having a lot of motor vehicle accidents in Fiji. And we'll take a short break, but when we come back, we'll discuss more in detail about these motor vehicle accidents. So stay with us for that. Since 2018 till date, the Accident Compensation Commission of Fiji has paid in excess of $14 million for motor vehicle accident through compensation. Let's talk about the nature of these motor vehicle accidents. Of course, we see that ACCF always does advocacy on road safety, workplace safety as well. What are some of the most common causes of motor vehicle accidents, especially the ones that have been compensated for?
Sure. So when we look at the applications that we are receiving, the common ones are careless driving, dangerous driving, and within dangerous driving you've got overspeeding. There's pedestrian negligence as well, and of course you've got drunk driving and so on. So but these are the main ones.
So, pardon my being blunt, you would have had to compensate for families where loss of life has occurred, and in instances like that where there's a no-fault scheme in place, it is a bit of a tricky situation to have to compensate them for the loss of a loved one, yet at the same time try and work around the legalities of what may ensue, whether or not there was the driver that was at fault, or maybe there was an accident or a collision that was unavoidable. In instances like that, does it complicate the work that the ACCF does?
Look, it doesn't complicate the work, because we are guided by the Act and the regulations, and so the team of course are quite aware of the sentiments of the applicants and so on. However, they can only work within the ambit of the law, and so if there is an exclusion that applies, it will be applied. And there have been cases, and I'm glad you've asked the question, because there have been cases where we have had to decline compensation to families where while the fault aspect doesn't come in, but there was an exclusion that applied. So there was a case, for example, where a taxi driver was drunk, and in fact he had marijuana in his system as well. And so with the zero tolerance for PSV drivers, the law is very clear. So as much as the team wanted to assist that family, and that family was one of those families that definitely needed compensation. You know, their financial position was such that if there was a deserving family financially, that was it. But we couldn't compensate because of the circumstances under which the death occurred. And so as much as the team wanted to assist, there was no way of paying compensation, because unfortunately this driver was, and I know, God rest his soul, he's passed away, but he was silly enough to be completely drunk and under the influence of drugs as a taxi driver. So
let's take this time to discuss more about these exclusions that you've mentioned.
Sure.
So of course the no fault scheme is something that we have discussed, but on what other basis can the ACCF refuse compensation? What are the exclusions?
Sure. So if the driver is drunk or under the influence of drugs, if the driver fails to or refuses to provide a breath test or blood test, So basically a sample of breath and so on. And so that's the other advice, is that if the police pull you over and ask for a breath sample or a blood sample, you need to comply. So that's another exclusion. If the license that they hold doesn't match the vehicle that they're driving, and I gave the example earlier of a minivan, the same would apply to someone passing themselves off as a PSV driver and not holding a PSV license. And so, for example, we know there's a lot of private jobs in Fiji. Now, those private job drivers, if they're found to be doing a private job and passing themselves off as a PSV driver, those drivers, whether they're seriously injured or whether they die, will never get compensation from ACCF. And so that's another exclusion. There's also things like if the vehicle is not licensed. And also in the employment space, there's an exclusion where if someone is applying for compensation as a worker, but actually they're not a worker in reality. An example would be, say, if MBC hires an external contractor to come and fix the lights, and they're seriously injured, and they claim to be a worker of MBC, when in fact legally they're not a worker of MBC. They may be a worker of somebody else or an independent contractor. So those are the kind of exclusions that apply.
So one of the interesting ones that you mentioned was when the license that you're carrying doesn't match the vehicle.
Yes.
So one instance of this could be if I, for example, borrowed a friend's car and then I sustained an injury in that car through an accident.
Right. So if you borrowed a friend's car and you've got a license to drive that type of vehicle, then you're fine. So borrowing someone's car is fine. And in fact, it's interesting. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that would be an example of how people would miss out on compensation in the past. Whereas our scheme is far more generous. We would compensate, we would give you compensation. You would not get compensation if you borrowed a friend's taxi.
So within the class of your license.
So if you've got a normal driver's license to drive a car, and you then borrow someone else's car, and your license allows you to drive that type of vehicle, then you're okay. You end up driving a minivan or a truck, and you only have got, so you borrow a friend's truck or something, that's when the issue arises.
So one of the reasons, if you look at the money that's been paid out, so for motor vehicle accidents, it's 14 million, and the next closest is employment accidents, only 2 million. So, I mean, it's safe to say it's substantially higher amount, but as you explained earlier on, that right from the start, right from the get-go, you've been paying out motor vehicle accident compensation, which is perhaps the reason why that number is so high.
It is.
But do you see that, like, the amount of applications that come to you, is that also reflected in those applications? So the most number of applications are for motor vehicle?
Well, in fact, no, because what we've found is, since we've taken over employment accidents, the applications for employment accidents and injuries have in fact now exceeded motor vehicle. And so the employment space is fast catching up, and so going forward you will see far more compensation payments for employment accidents, and it's that 1 year lag because of the time that doctors will wait for an impairment assessment that causes that lag. But otherwise the number of applications, when you look at that, they have actually exceeded for motor vehicle accidents.
So we'll take a short break, and when we come back we'll discuss more in detail about workplace accidents, so stay with us for that.
Welcome back. Mr. Akbar, before we move on to employment and workplace compensations, just a wrap-up question for motor vehicle accidents and compensation for that. So one might come to a conclusion that with all of the data that is being collected and collated by all of the relevant agencies, by LTA, by Fiji Police, by ACCF, you might think about a collaborative approach to try and cull the number of motor vehicle accidents that occurs, and thereby also lessening the amount that ACCF would have to pay, because safety is paramount. Now, with that in mind, has there been any talks, any sort of scheme that has been put into play, or any plans in the pipeline to collate this and maybe come up and strengthen the current framework for drivers and trying to introduce demerit points or probably suspension of license for those that are most at risk or those that may be habitual offenders?
Sure, and it's a good question. And in fact, from the outset, ACCF has proactively engaged with the stakeholders, police and LTA and others, to work on road safety. And in fact, LTA and ACCF, we ran a joint advertising campaign on road safety with MBC actually, and so that was quite successful. We've also done in fact, for the first time in the history of Fiji, we did a coffee drive to address driver fatigue, and we did that in collaboration with the Fiji Police Force. So there's a few things that we proactively try and get involved in, and of course the data is helpful as well to sort of see where the hotspots are, etc. And there's always opportunity to continue that dialogue and do more in that space for sure.
So let's move on to workplace accidents. You mentioned before the break that now the most number of complaints that you're getting are for workplace or employment accidents, employment-related accidents. What are the most common type of accidents that occur in the workplace? What is the severity of these accidents and how frequently are they occurring?
Yeah, okay, so the most common types, you're looking at slips, trips and falls, you're looking at handling machinery, and hazardous material, etc. Those are the sort of top ones that cause the accidents, and a lot of them are avoidable. And in terms of its frequency, it's very regular. We get daily notifications of employment accidents, and we keep track of that. And we try and do as much awareness as possible to ensure that companies operate a safe work environment to prevent these from happening.
So I'm guessing a lot of your work when it comes to employment accidents is also in relation to Health and Safety at Work Act, because the Health and Safety at Work Act and the regulations that come under that act also quite comprehensively cover workplace accidents and what the penalties that apply for non-compliance of health and safety at work. So, the majority of complaints that you have received, have you noted that there was a lack of OHS awareness or OHS standards at those workplaces?
Sure. So just in terms of these applications we're receiving for compensation, what the team does is, what we do is we will analyze the facts, and if we find that there's potentially been a breach by an employer of health and safety standards, we refer that employer to the OHS team in the Ministry of Employment, who are responsible for enforcement. Right. So we don't enforce, we don't have those powers or carry a big stick in that sense. Our role is more to compensate. But where there are those kind of breaches, the team identifies them and refers them on. But however, we do definitely keep a close eye on that. And in terms of, nevertheless, in terms of OHS awareness, we do a lot of that. We do a lot on social media, print media, TVC, as well as radio, in terms of safe ways of working, etc. Because there's quite a lot of serious accidents that occur.
What is the level of compliance, would you say, from most of the complaints and also compensation that has been given out? What's the nature of it? Is it more to do with non-compliance on the terms of, say, for example, the employer, or is it just an accident that was unavoidable?
Look, in many instances, it's just an accident that was basically unavoidable. But there are circumstances where there is a safety breach, the right equipment has not been provided by the employer, or there isn't the proper process in place, procedures in place. Maybe some employees haven't been given adequate induction and training on health and safety and so on. So there is that element as well. Yeah.
So under the ACCF scheme, there's a different payout for an injury and there's a different payout for death.
Yes.
Is it different for the workplace? Or
no. So and that's one thing that's good, is we've maintained consistency across those three types of accidents. So whether it's a motor vehicle accident or an employment accident or a school accident, the maximum for injury is $150,000. How much you get depends on the severity of your injury. And that severity is determined by a medical practitioner who does an assessment. So it's called a whole person impairment assessment. So basically they assess your injury after about 18 to 20 months to see whether there's any further healing. They assign a percentage, they give that percentage to us, and then we use that to determine how much compensation is payable. So that's how we do that. So there's consistency across all three types of accidents, and for death, for all three areas, we pay $75,000.
So one of the questions that we always get is, since we're on this subject, and I know when you've been on the show earlier, we've already addressed this question, but I feel like I should ask it again. This is something that people always wonder: why is the payout for death sometimes lower than the payout for an injury?
Right, and the answer is that with injury, the person living with the injury, it's an enduring thing. So there's ongoing medical costs, etc. So there's an assessment done, and again, it depends on the severity. You may end up getting less than what someone would.
Yeah.
But in the case of very serious injuries, so like the highest we've paid, for example, is about $132,000 we paid this lady. So she was pretty much bedridden, but then she's got ongoing medical costs and so on. Whereas, without sounding crude, but with death, I mean, the person's died and passed on, and so there's nothing more to assess or and further expenses and so on. So then there's a fixed amount for that.
So the money that's paid out in the event of an injury also takes into account someone providing care for that person, or the future circumstances of that person?
No, the amount paid out is purely based on the assessment of the injury. But of course that does take into account when that injury is assessed. The practitioners do take into account the usage of, for example, an arm going forward and what work they do and so on.
If I may, with that in mind, because you do happen to have instances where some may try to cheat the system, even with debilitating injury that may occur.
Yes.
Now, with that in mind, say, for example, someone has a workplace injury and they either have a loss of limb or a very serious injury that does require compensation. The ACCF does pay them, and then later on they're able to regain gainful employment again. And in that instance, if they suffer another injury, can they then file for another compensation while they're still currently receiving compensation for their previous injury?
Okay, well, thanks for the question, Geraldine. So, first of all, the compensation payments are lump sum payments. So, it'll be paid one hit and that's it. So, it's not done in installments. So, once they've received it, that's it. And then, if they subsequently suffer another injury, workplace injury, or what have you, then and they make an application, then the application will be treated independent of the previous application. The injuries will be assessed by the medical practitioner, and from that we will be able to ascertain whether in fact it's related to the previous injury or not. And so we will compensate if there's another injury, if they're unlucky enough to sustain another injury, we will compensate for the fresh injury, for the new injury, provided it is infected new injury. And that's something we would work with the medical practitioner. And I understand what you're saying around attempts to defraud the system and so on. And we keep a close eye on that, and we would work with the practitioner. And there have been cases where we've gone back to the medical practitioner and asked 5 more questions to ascertain the authenticity of the injury.
So we'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll get into school injuries and expand more on how those injuries have been happening and the money that's been paid out, as well as carry on our discussion on workplace injuries. So we'll be back after a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. This is our final segment, and we're with the Accident Compensation Commission of Fiji discussing motor vehicle accidents, workplace accidents, and school injuries as well, and the compensation that's been paid out. When we were in our last segment, we left off our discussion on the nature of the injuries. So suppose something that happens over a period of time, an injury that you sustain from your workplace because of something that may have happened at the workplace, and it happens over a period of time. How does that compensation, is someone like that liable for compensation? How does it work, and how do you make the assessment then?
So you're saying that the injury is ongoing, if you like?
Yes, it's an injury that you've sustained over a period of years
or not something that is sudden.
Not something that happens suddenly.
Oh, I see, okay. So with compensation, it's compensation for injuries from an actual an accident.
So as an event.
Yes. So there's an accident that takes place, and then so all injuries sustained as a result of that accident are basically the people are eligible to compensation. And so if you've got a historic or back issue, etc., those won't, and again, it comes down to the medical analysis, but those won't be eligible for compensation, those types of injuries. Yeah.
Now, if I may, just to digress a little bit, say, for example, in my job, if I happen to have to wear certain equipment, and that equipment is for the purpose of the job that I may be doing. However, continuous use of the equipment may cause an injury, either loss of hearing or possibly may cause loss of vision. In terms like that, you were saying that I would not be able to get compensation. I would need an event that would cause an injury. Then I would be liable. Sorry, then I would be able to get compensation.
Well, you see, our compensation is for personal injuries and death from an employment accident. So the definition of an accident, when you look at it, is basically anything arising out of and in the course of employment. So if you're using equipment which actually causes, even like we also cover prescribed diseases, which are diseases occurring as a result of the workplace. So if it's directly caused by the workplace or something that's happening at work, then we would certainly consider it.
Okay, but I mean, that's simple enough. It seems it needs a direct cause.
There has to be a direct link between, yeah, absolutely.
So let's move on to discussing school injuries. Relatively minor amount paid out, $147,000. What type of school injuries have been compensated for? What are the cases that came before you?
Well, in terms of school accidents, I mean, it's a new area, and this area sort of fell into a bit of a hole in the past, and so many parents have actually not pursued it because it hasn't been worth it. The injury has been minor, or who's going to hire lawyers? The compensation might be far less than the lawyer's fees. Who do you sue? So there are all these challenges. In terms of the types of injuries, they range from loss of teeth. There was one student who lost a couple of teeth in school because of a bit of an accident. We paid $3,000 for that. There was another student whose entire jaw collapsed and got fractured during a sporting event. We paid about $21,000 for that. And then of course you've got minor slips and trips and so on. Of course we compensate, and this is for all three areas. We compensate for serious injury, so there has to be permanent incapacity, and so that's the thing that we look for. But if provided there is permanent incapacity, we will compensate. So, but these are sort of examples of what we've compensated for so far.
And is there a special, I guess, operating procedure when you're dealing with students? Because school injuries are substantially different from motor vehicle and employment accidents, right?
Well, the definition of how you qualify is different, in the sense that it has to be an accident within the school hours on the school premises, or it could be elsewhere, but provided it's a school activity or event. That's different. But in terms of how we assess the injuries and process it, it's the same as motor vehicle and employment, in the sense we look at the nature of the injuries. There's a waiting period after which the doctors do a medical assessment, and that percentage assigning that I was talking about earlier is precisely the same.
So again, since you're dealing with minors, you would need either the parent or the guardian to step forward to claim for compensation.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And have you had any instances where parents or guardians would want to claim for compensation, but maybe the school or anyone involved within that particular area would try and step in to mediate and to avoid getting into the spotlight, shall we say, because school is, of course, an area where you wouldn't want your children to get hurt, and if such a case were to be reported to the ACCF, they would feel as though there may be negative criticism that will come their way.
So I'm glad you raised that. Schools, just like employers, have a legal obligation to notify. So with employment accidents, there's a legal obligation to notify ACCF and the Ministry of Employment. For school accidents, the school basically has to notify Ministry of Education as well as ACCF. So that's a legal obligation. So if the schools don't, there'll be problems for them, from a legal perspective. That's one thing. So there's a form that they fill in to notify. In terms of your specific question around application, one of the good things that we've done is that an application for compensation can be made directly, or should be made directly to ACCF. So they don't have to go through the school for compensation. And the same thing we've done in the employment space. In what I call the bad old days, employees, if you got hurt at work, what you would need to do in the bad old days, first of all, you'd have to prove fault, your employer's fault. Then you'd have to fill in a form, and that form would be lodged with Ministry of Employment by your employer. So you were at the mercy of your employer to do the right thing and lodge a compensation application for you. Now that's ridiculous. And so we've removed that both in the employment space as well as in the school space. So in the school space, the parent or legal guardian do not have to engage with the school. They just come straight to us for compensation, as does the worker. So it's much simpler now.
So we're coming to an end of the show, and just before we wrap up, we'd like to talk to you about ACCF services possibly expanding in the future. Nearly almost 3 years since ACCF began paying out compensation, and of course over the years from motor vehicle accidents you've expanded to employment and school injuries as well. So what can we expect in the coming future from the ACCF?
Well, this at the moment the focus is to continue the awareness, and we, in the last 3 years we've done quite a lot of awareness, but there are still areas we would like to reach out to, and people would like to reach out to who may not be as au fait with the scheme, and so we continue to do awareness. So at the moment there's a heavy focus on increasing the awareness and continuing to assist the applicants. In terms of expanding the scope, in the future there may be an opportunity to expand into other types of accidents, such as sporting injuries and so on, but that's not the focus right now. The focus right now is on awareness.
So just a final question for any member of the public that's watching us this evening. If they want to access compensation, if they feel like they have a right to compensation under the ACCF scheme, all they need to do is just walk into one of your offices? They
can walk into one of our offices. We're on Facebook, and we'll answer questions on Facebook. We have a website, www.accf.com.fj, or email is info@accf.com.fj.
Mr. Akbar, it's been a great discussion. Great having you here. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Always a pleasure.
And that's all we have for you on the show tonight. Have a good evening.